Welcome to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Life Behind Bars. Today we're talking about prisons around the world, and we're talking about criminal justice around the world. So picking up prisons in other countries, we obviously talk a lot about the UK, but we're going to try and stretch further afield. Now I've picked up a load of stats for today, so we can run through those. There's some chops and changes obviously post-COVID in terms of where those figures are. I've also, you'll like this, I've done some research by watching some different programs. Netflix has been king of my research this week. So watching things like the world's worst prisons and such like that. And actually we watched an episode together, and one of the things that we did pick up, and I thought this was really interesting because I think there's some great productions out there. Netflix have done a number of different inside prison shows. Ross Kemp is obviously the king of inside prisons. I know Danny Dyer did like the world's toughest prisons and stuff like that. But this one actually, it wasn't a bad show that's currently on Netflix you can watch. The one thing we did notice, and we always say this about productions, is they are productions. They're produced for you to watch and for your engagement and for your entertainment. And we watched one about a Filipino prison, which is one of the most overcrowded prisons in the world. And they were talking to gang members, they were talking to different things. We were sort of watching this, going, oh, okay, that looks real. But then they spoke to a guy, you never knows what's coming here. They spoke to a guy that was a famous rapper, and he was in prison, and he was saying he can earn more money in prison than outside of prison. So the presenter said to him, well, how do you do that? He said, well, I lend people money. They go, okay, what happens when they don't pay it? And he turns around and he goes, oh, well, you know, we ask them to pay it back. He goes, and what if they don't? And he went, oh, well, there's not a lot we can do because of the hierarchical system. And the other prisoner that was taking this presenter around was sat, he was stood there, and he was like going like this. He was asking the question, he went, and so I'm rolling my eyes, and basically I'm just looking straight up if you're listening to some podcast. And we both watched it, we just both burst into stage like
with the smirk on his face and the eye roll, it was just very clear, like, oh, what's he going to say here? Yeah. Because we can't tell the truth.
Yeah, and he clearly went with, oh, well, there's not a lot we can do because, you know, if we lend somebody money and they don't pay back, well, there's not really a lot we can do. And we were sat again, well, that doesn't bloody happen, clearly.
There's always a price to pay for debt,
so
either legally or not.
Exactly.
And it was a very gang-run
absolutely.
There
and
was,
you could just see on his face. And the presenter knew, because the presenter spent time in prison himself. So it was just one of those things. And I think where I'm getting at is that the shows are great to watch, but there is a production piece to it.
Yeah, even in the American ones, they always show you the ones very often where prisoners are in the higher security level and they're in these pods.
Yeah.
With very little work to do. Yeah. And that's probably not true of the whole criminal justice system of the United States. They have open prisons in America, what they call afforestation camps. They have them in Australia as well. And basically they're like our open prisons. They also have minimum security prisons in America as well. But they don't show you those because they're functioning relatively well and doing what they probably should be doing. So everything you see on TV, you have to take with a little bit of, you have to take quite a large lump of salt in there.
Showing things that are going well isn't good watching, is
no,
it?
It's
not
not
going to get the big audiences.
No, this is, that's exactly it. Let's pick up on the United States, because we're talking about prisons in different countries. United States of America is by far the head and shoulders above everybody else, the winner in terms of incarcerating people. So I've got my stats here. I'm going to be stato for the day, like I say. So America, these stats are a couple of years old, because obviously prisons do go over time, but they're right to each other at the point they were done, if that makes sense. So they'll have adjusted slightly now in terms of numbers, but they are right to each other as when they were done. So the US incarcerating 2,094,000 people.
That's a huge...
And that will be affected, and there'll be a huge variation amongst the states about the number of people they lock up. Remember, there are 50 states in America, so the reality is, if you broke it down, they might say somewhere up the north in New England, which is relatively a prosperous part, well, we don't lock anywhere near that many people up as a percentage. But down in Texas and Alabama and all those places, we lock up a much higher percentage of people down there.
They were the first two places that when you were going to obviously go there, they were the first two places that made me think high prison population.
Yeah. So the reality is that even though the United States do lock up more than all the others, that will have to be defined down at their own level as well, because it's being a very large country. But yeah, they are quite horrific numbers. They are. I'd like to know what the breakdown is between state prisoners and federal prisoners.
Do you know what?
It's difficult to find
I don't
properly.
actually have that figure. What I can tell you, I was just flicking through the stats now as I'm looking at it, is when we talk about there's 2 million prisoners effectively locked up in the UK. Across the world, or across the in the United States, sorry. I'm looking at all the stats. In the United States, there's 2 million. Let me put that into perspective very quickly. So when we take into consideration the 226 countries I've got listed in front of me, they total just under 11 million prisoners worldwide.
Of the ones that we know of.
Yeah, the ones we know of. And 2 million of those are in the US.
Yes.
That
So
says a lot, doesn't it?
20%
Yes,
are in one country.
Because lots of people will go, 2 million people, but America's a much bigger
Oh, yes,
the United
huge,
States is
huge.
a much bigger
Yeah,
country than here. But actually, when it's done,
20%
all
of the world's
countries-
population of prisoners, 20% of the world's prison population is in one country.
Yeah, that's it. The fact that the rest of the
With a
world
country
is
less than
together.
5% of the population.
Yeah, although when we come in very close behind it, China's not far behind. They're at 1.7 million.
Yeah, but they've got 1 billion people in their country.
Oh, well, that's okay.
America's
Until I've got 1.7
Well, no,
million, that's fine. I've got a billion.
percentage.
But that's a
wise,
percentage-wise. You go, we only lock up 5% of our population, and you lock up 10, and there's only 330 million United States
Yeah.
population. So you
So
we have to quote things as percentage of countries.
Yeah,
Hard,
yeah.
cold figures don't really measure properly,
No,
do they?
because it's like comparing UK to US.
Yeah.
The populations are so different that they're going to have.
Let's compare it off the totals, because that's a nice way of doing it. So if we look at the per capita, so prisoners per 100,000, the average across the globe is 169 people per 100,000. America's running in at 639.
Yeah, it's
So 5 times the average, effectively.
and they run two separate systems, don't they? They run the state system,
Yeah.
where each state has its own relative laws to lock people up. They
Yeah.
call them jails,
Yeah.
and that's usually run and controlled by sheriffs.
Yeah, I was going to say
Check
there's
the
a difference between jails and prisons in
And
the
then,
US.
then a prison in America basically is a federal. It's a federal prison and a state jail. So,
What I did
and all
find,
states will be locking people up at a different rate for different offences, of course.
yeah, and what I did find with again, as you'd probably expect with a male-female split, 90% male, 10% female in the US. I think one of the things that really surprised me was the occupancy level. So the occupancy level in the way they look at occupancy level is how close you are to full capacity of prison. So if you take 10,000 prisoners and you've got 11,000, you're obviously over, and if
Yes.
you've got 9,000, you're over. America, 99.8% occupancy.
And there's a reason for that.
Wow.
The research that I did, and it showed that many of these prisoners that are in jail are working for the benefit of companies outside. They're
Yeah.
literally subcontracted out. Some are going out to work on the roads, they'll be the lower security prisoners, and or working on the farms, collecting the vegetables, picking the fruit, and others are working in the workshops. But there's a much bigger emphasis in America of using that prison labour for the benefit of private companies.
This has gone back hugely historically with America, hasn't it?
Yeah,
Because
it's-
when they first
Yes.
abolished
Slavery.
slavery, they obviously could no longer have slaves, but what they did was incarcerated lots and lots of
Young black males.
young black
They got-
males
and then-
and used prisoners as
labour.
slave labour,
Yeah.
so they were still
Yeah.
Well, we
technically
spoke about this.
slave labour.
Absolutely, we spoke about this a little bit in episode 3, I think it was, when we were talking about prisoner roles and such like that. And I did say, I made that statement a little while ago, that you can run prisons in a different way to how we do now, in terms of like the US. And actually, there's a reason why the UK is starting to move towards the model that they have. And in America, I would say prisons are. There's a deterrent piece, absolutely. There always will be. There's a punishment piece, which is probably more prevalent in America than the rehabilitation piece. I don't know. I'm making a bit of a guesstimate here. But prisons in America are businesses.
Yes.
And they're one of the most well-organised, well-structured and well-run businesses you've got, because when you're running at 99.8% of occupancy, i.e. capacity,
And building.
yeah, you're running at 0.2% loss margin.
Yeah.
That's
Remember,
it.
the
0.2%.
power base-
What a capitalism
Yeah.
regime to be able to get. If I could get my business to 0.2%, we'd be doing the show from a boat.
Yeah.
It's,
The
In the
power
Caribbean.
base, the power base in America is coming out of the companies very often, whereas it's not coming out of the criminal justice system. you probably find that you've got the private companies there to a degree are controlling the policy of criminal justice, and it's starting in this country to leak slowly the same way.
And that's a concern, isn't it? Because when you look at things like America's statistics, US's statistics, then
America's a continent, Emma.
when you look at the US statistics, their system doesn't work. Their recidivism rates, so the reoffending rates are so much greater than countries that have more proactive kind of rehabilitation systems. So therefore, by following down that rate, we're not going to improve our criminal justice system here by...
Well, we made the step way back in 1990 with the first private prison that was built in this country on the other side of the country, in a prison called HMP The Wolds.
Yeah.
And what happened was a couple of MPs at the time, would have been the Tory government in there, had gone across to America, and they were looking at American prison systems to see how to do things. I'm not quite sure why we need to go there to do that. And one of them happened to have shares in G4S at the time. I think it was G4, but it wasn't called G4S then. It was called Greek Force Security, something like that.
Yeah, it is
one of those companies.
G4S. Yeah.
So he came over, and then suddenly, out of the middle of nowhere, we decided to build the first private prison. We're now up to 18 private prisons in the country. Admittedly, there are 120 prisons in the country, so it's still a relatively small number. But that doesn't mean to say that the government one day might find a tipping point in that and go, okay, once we get over 30, we'll just privatise everything else.
It's a small number. Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, stats can always be taken in different ways. I think it would be a small number if you had 18 prisons being run privately by 4 or 5 different prison operators. But it's being run by a single prison.
No, there's about 4 companies running.
Oh, is there 4? Is there 4? Oh,
you've got different companies. You've got Serco run them, and then you've got G4S or whatever they call run them. They are come down from about 4 to about 2 or 3 now.
Yeah, that's
they
what
are
I mean.
slightly. So what they're doing is they're literally monopolising. And if they monopolise more and more and more, then they'll have bigger power base to start pushing for some more. Wellingborough, I believe, that's just been built now to hold 2,000 prisoners. I believe that's going to the private industry. And they're building one up in Leicester, a place called Glenparva, on top of an old borstal that used to be there. And I believe that's going out to the private ones already.
You can see that almost that
well, I'm going to pull us back on
this. And they're
this.
planning on another 4 or 5 big prisons in the next 5 years.
Officer Goodwin.
Sorry.
Occasionally I have to pull rank, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because if you didn't shout, you'd never get in on this.
I'm going to pull back off this because I know that when we record episode 9, which we'll probably have recorded by the time this goes out anyway, but episode 9 specifically is going to be about prison labour and different ways of doing it. So we will pick up on the US system, we'll pick up on like the Norwegian system, we'll pick up on the UK system, but specifically I want to touch on that one. Certainly how I think that prisons are moving and the government's manoeuvring us to, without people even realising it, this labour world, this prison labour world, not a labour world, that might be better than the Conservative world, but let's not start that. Prison to this prisoner labour world, and what that looks like, and the privatisation is the beginning part of that. So let's try and pick that up in episode 9, otherwise we'll get bogged down to that. So China is running in at number 2 in terms of the highest population of prisoners, but funny enough, they're only at 121 per 100,000, which is well below the average of 169. So actually, the average is lower. Got to take those figures with a bit of a touch of salt. America is 639. Yeah. So yeah, like 5 times higher than China.
Most of those have been created in the last 20 years.
In China?
No,
in America.
In the United States.
Yeah, well...
Most of them.
Yeah, like I said, there's varying reasons. China's prison, although it doesn't have a split between remand and convicted in terms of China. What it does do is has very, very few foreign prisoners. 0.4% of foreign prisoners currently in prison in China. So it's a tiny percentage, whereas in America it's 5.2% of foreign prisoners. So there's quite a difference in terms of how many international...
That leads to immigration, doesn't it, about how many people would be looking to go and live in China as opposed to how many people want to go and live in America. Yeah. America's still seen as the streets are paved with gold, the richest country in the world, the most one with the most opportunities and freedoms, whereas people might go, well, I'm so keen to go to China.
And also America aren't actually very welcoming to other people.
No, they're not.
We saw
Many people that go into Russia to live don't really come from the western side of the world. They come from most of the other Eastern European countries.
Yeah.
Many of them.
There was some really surprising stats when I looked through this. I'm going to jump to the opposite end at the moment now, to Monaco. So how many people do you think are currently in prison in Monaco?
What's the population size, do you know?
Do you know what, it's the figure I didn't pull up. All the stats I've got, I didn't bring the population size.
I would have said that as a percentage, it's probably taking, it's hard to take per 100,000 people.
It is, yeah.
I reckon they must be down around probably 12 or 13 per 100,000 of their population.
You are good at this game, aren't you?
That's a guess. That's a guess, folks.
21.
Oh dear.
21. There's currently 8 people in prison.
Right.
And out of those 8 people, 85% are male, and 4% or 5% are national. 95% are international, so foreign prisoners, of which 76% are on remand. So they've only got 2 prisoners in prison
Serving a conviction
that are from the actual country that will be male.
Yeah.
And I said that to Emma, and she went, drugs.
No.
For the international prisoners. For the other ones, you did say trafficking. Well, I assume they're trafficking drugs.
But oddly
Oddly
enough, with those figures, if you think of Jersey in this country, or Guernsey,
I've got Guernsey.
Guernsey send their prisoners, if they're serving a long sentence or a high security prisoner, they send them to serve their time here in the UK.
Yeah.
So if they're already going to be what they call Category A status or long-term Cat B, they go, we don't have the physical buildings to hold these prisoners, so there's a deal with Guernsey, come to us. So it may look like they've got a very low number.
87.
Right, but you don't know how many more there are that are already serving in the UK.
But their capita is really high. It's 132 per 100,000.
That's what I mean.
So the capita, well, you go for 87, that's nothing.
No.
But if you've got a population of 90, then it's
That's
huge.
Yes,
It's huge.
absolutely. Yeah.
So you've got to take the per capita, and I thought that was quite interesting. So Monaco actually is the second lowest in the world, just beaten by San
So why do
Marino.
you think that is, though? Is that because they're
It's a tiny, tiny country.
and they're vastly more wealthy?
Huge wealth. Huge wealth.
So we
Massive
won't talk about this now, but the socio-economics of different areas.
No, I think now's a perfect time
Well, I
to talk
thought we'd
about
do it
it.
next week with the. Oh no, we can do it with work. Yeah.
Well,
if you look at
the
Monaco,
next episode is riots, and then next week next week, I don't know if you remember, but next week we're on to manslaughter and talk about Ruth Ellis, or episode 7, I should say. We're talking about manslaughter, Ruth Ellis. Episode 8 is death penalty. Yeah. So actually, I think out of all the episodes, because episode 9 we're doing labour, and then episode 10 is about Christmases and holidays and stuff like that.
So I imagine in Monaco, where people are relatively much wealthier as a big percentage of that population, or don't suffer the same kind of huge sort of poverty levels that we might, they're not going to be burglars and car thieves. They're not going to be muggers.
No, it's multi-million-pound F1 drivers.
Yes.
Lewis Hamilton lives in Monaco.
So
doesn't
their numbers should be low if you agree that lower socioeconomic groups usually caught up in the crime far more than the higher level.
It's where Alan Sugar keeps his boat, and they have an annual boat fair. I think you can tell me.
Why do you think they keep their boats there?
Yeah, well, it's safe, yeah. But I think it's one of the world's largest or most expensive marinas. Yeah, I say largest, but most expensive marinas. It's huge, yeah. So it's completely different.
It's their way of living in a gated community.
But let's take then let's kind of compare that slightly. So then if we take Andorra. So Andorra is an interesting one because Andorra again is very rich. It's the home of where the World Economic Forum Summit. No, sorry, that is not. Sorry, that's Davos. So Andorra is I've been there skiing. We've been there skiing. So it's again a small country. Small country.
What about Switzerland? I'm interested to know what the ratio would be in Switzerland, where it's crime level.
Let me just. Joel, let's take a very quick break there whilst I find Switzerland. That's a great time to take a break. Well worked in there, Officer Goodwin. So we'll take a couple of minutes. I'm just trying to find my break outro. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm completely lost. You've thrown me off. Hold on, let me find it. There it is. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back after this.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Unlock the past and discover what life was like at Shepton Mallet Prison. Relive the history of past prisoners over the last 400 years. Experience what a Victorian prison cell was like for those incarcerated. See where executions were carried out. Walk the landings and prison wings. You'll hear stories of those who worked and lived behind its high walls. See it, touch it, feel it on a journey of discovery at the nation's oldest prison. Visit sheptonmalletprison.com today to find out more.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back. You're listening to Life Behind Bars. We're talking all about prisons around the world, so criminal justice around the world. Although I don't know how much we're talking about criminal justice. We're just talking about just general numbers and the reasoning behind it in prisons. Graham asked, Officer G asked before the break about Switzerland's figures. I've dug them out. They are, I mean, you know, we're saying the count is kind of a something and nothing. 6,906 prisoners, but they are 80 per 100,000.
More than I thought.
Well, it's remembering that total is 169, so they are about half underneath the average. So half of the average, 80 prisoners per 100,000.
I wonder how many of those people are the ones that actually come into that country to work.
Well, I can tell you, 69% are foreign.
There you go.
Of which 42% are currently on remand.
There you go.
So nearly half their prisoners are actually not convicted.
So the nationals
and
that live
70%, 30%.
only make up quite a small percentage by international standards. So that may be about wealth again.
Yeah. What was it? I mean, what you were saying about Switzerland in the break, weren't you?
Make everybody wealthy, cut most of your crime.
Yeah, well...
Not all of it, but most of it.
Yeah, I mean...
It'd be interesting to know, in that sense, the difference statistics between the types of crimes, the lower end, the robberies and the thefts and things like that, opposed to the emotive kind of emotional violent crimes.
Yeah. Well, I think with emotive crime, they're always going to exist in every society.
Yeah, because
the only difference is in society, there's probably a bit more of a break on it, depends on the culture of the country. If you go to some of your South American countries, not all of them, of course, and some of your other, what they tend to call third world countries, you may find their whole version of how the law runs anyway is not the same as perhaps ours would be. So there's not so much, I don't know, going along with it, which is why their prison populations may be much, much higher and much more dangerous places to be in. When you mentioned at the very beginning of the show about wherever it was, the Philippines?
Philippines, yeah.
Yeah, but that may be a reflection of society. What you're looking at may not always be, well, they are like that in prison. They just might be their whole society probably tolerates it a little bit more. I'm not sure that's a good word, but they might tolerate that level of sort of...
Well, it does come back to that culture, doesn't it? It comes back to what's going on in society and how life is in general in that area, and what people are willing to accept in terms of the sentencing as well,
and what people feel they've got control of within the system of government that they live with. Yeah. That's, you know, unless people have got...
Let's pick up the Philippines for a second, because it's not an overly rich country, the Philippines, obviously. I mean, the areas, it's not. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's third world at all. But
no, I don't think it is. No, they produce a huge amount of nurses that we take into this country, which many people didn't realise. I know this is an aside, folks. The government actually subsidises the Philippine government to train those nurses for us to receive them. I didn't know that until quite recently. Yeah, I was reading it up because they said, oh, we're that short of nurses. I found out that the Philippine nurses that come here, that they train them, and they're going to say, well, we train these people. Where's our payback? Yeah. So our government actually subsidise, probably give them a wedge of money to cover the cost of training. That's the reality.
Well, let's pick up, because I think one of the interesting figures that I found, and actually one of the things we watched when we were watching the programmes, was about how the Filipino government are managing things like the war on drugs, because they've got a lot of drug crime over there, and we watched it, and we were watching a programme on it, and we were watching the Filipino Prime Minister. I think it's Prime Minister, not President, but he was basically talking about the war on drugs, and they were saying that producers, dealers, users,
and
he said shoot them dead.
Yes.
Yeah, that was it. Shoot them and shoot them dead.
The only problem is you can't kill an addiction.
Well, you can if you kill the person that's got the addiction.
You'll be shooting them forever.
Well, that may well
You will
be.
never
It's-
kill the addiction. You can only manage
I
the
suppose
addiction. You can't kill it.
But
You might be able to kill the producers, but guarantee as long as you've got the addicts underneath the
if
tip,
there's
It was-
a new producer will take
law
over.
of economics.
Yeah.
If there's a demand, someone will create a supply.
Proved that in Colombo when they arrested, I forgot his name now, the big honcho over there. Many years ago they arrested him, chucked him in jail, and somebody stepped straight into his shoes and carried on because it's a multi-billion-pound business. They'll take their risks. They'll have their little armies. They'll have their fortresses to live in. They'll take their chances.
I'm not sure they have little armies. Some of the drug
Well,
producers, I think they have pretty big armies.
Many of them
Some
have
have
the
a police force, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's. Sorry, did you want to jump in?
No, sorry.
Let's pick up the Philippines quickly because when we talk about remand prisoners, the average worldwide is to have about 33% of your prison population on remand. That's just the average. If we take somewhere like America, they have 23% on remand. So it's just under a quarter, effectively, of their prison population awaiting trial. I would imagine these figures are probably slightly higher post-COVID because obviously the courts haven't been running and such like that. In the Philippines, however, 75% of the prison population are on remand. 75% of people in prison in the Philippines awaiting trial. And some of those are in there for years before they get trial.
That looks then much greater the kind of criminal justice system in the country, doesn't it, rather than just the prison.
Yeah.
Because we spoke, you
It's
spoke the other week
When
about
you compare the Philippines with such a high level, a non-remand and may never ever see a court of justice for many years and serve longer than they would have got originally. In America, they're into convictions much quicker.
Yeah.
But that may be something to do with the plea bargaining state that goes on in America. Or United States, sorry. What they do is they'll go to court and there's a whole process, like some kind of business deal going on. And what they'll do is they'll start to look at plea bargaining, and that means the defence and the prosecution get involved in the plea bargaining.
Yeah.
So you may find somebody goes, okay, I'll give you that if you plead to this, or I'll plead to that if you give me this, and we'll do a deal. So you may find the conviction rate is higher, not because of convictions by juries, but by convictions of people taking the plea bargain to squeeze down the amount of time they spend in jail.
It will be,
Yeah.
and no, you're right. I think you're right.
There's
One
a
of the
huge
reasons why
incentive
they
to do
have
so.
that is it's about efficiency. Because if you look at the split in America between jails and prisons, a jail is where remand prisoners yet to be convicted go, and they're normally localised in terms of in their states.
step by
And then
step.
you have your prisons, and your prisons are traditionally your federal prisons, although you can have state-run prisons. But that is where people go once they've been convicted. In a jail, all they do all day generally is they sit around waiting, whereas in prison, they actually are then producing.
Exactly.
You can't produce in a jail, so therefore getting you out of the jail into production, it's almost like you could argue it's your induction or training into producing something.
So the more you
because I think
convict,
it's
the better
something
your
like
labour force.
90, it's something like
Fits there.
96% of the Army's American military equipment, not guns, but equipment, is made in US prisons.
It fits what their
Yeah,
society
absolutely.
is building.
Let me come
When
back
you
to
look
the-
at a country like the Philippines,
Yeah.
where they've got that huge remand population, it again is that reflection of society and the differences in how people are treated and the expectations and the what people feel they have control of within their society, and that whole human rights is a different level of
Human rights
acceptance.
means something different to everybody that says it, even though it is one set standard of conditions, because it's human rights. You can read it,
Yeah.
but everybody has a different interpretation about what that is. We don't take it at face value. Everybody, depends on the country you come from, it depends on your level of poverty, your success, how much information, how much influence you've got in your own country's government,
and your education.
your education, all those things may decide how you value human rights.
Well, and lots of Filipino prisoners, as we were saying, don't read or write very well, so
No.
they have those educations. One of the things they do come out top on is the occupancy rates. 463% of their occupancy, which doesn't surprise me because they've got such a high remand level. And actually, the most overpopulated prison in the world is in the Philippines. It was built originally for 6,435 prisoners, and it currently incarcerates. Do you want to take a guess?
Could go for 25.
Oh, he's so good at this game. 28,500. Built for 6,500 and holds 28,500. So that's what, four times?
And that's
4.5
because
times
it's
his
probably in
capacity.
their mind, they have this, squeeze them in there. The harder it is for them to do, the more dangerous it is for them, the less likely they are to come back. And I go, well, that's
Do you
obviously
not,
not
do you
true.
not just think it's just the fact of that they don't have necessarily the money to build more prisons and to staff the prisons? Because it seems very much the Filipino model, and there's plenty of other countries that have this exact same system, so it's not by any means just the Philippines, is the prison officers run the perimeter,
Yes.
or their guards in those countries, and the prisoners run the prison.
Yeah.
There was something like one
One to
officer
400
to 400
prisoners.
Yes.
prisoners.
So when you worked in prison, it was what, 1 to 30, 1 to 40
Well, it depends
ratio.
on your security, but it would have been.
I wonder what their system is like, for there to be such a huge remand population and such overpopulated prisons. I wonder what the system is like in terms of actually processing and whether or not they care. I don't know if that's
No.
the right
I
thing
can't
to say.
remember. I watched a
Like, and the
documentary
fact
on one
that-
prison. I think it was in. Sorry, go on.
The fact that the people, the interview part that we saw with the rapper that was in prison, and he was just, well, I make more money in prison. So
Yeah.
therefore, there's also that.
It's not
almost
deterrent then, is it?
Exactly.
Right.
There's a percentage of the population who then it's easier for them to be in prison.
There is, well, I can't remember, it was a documentary I saw probably a few years ago now, somewhere, it may have been the South American country, where they run them exactly as you say, with very few guards. They don't really walk and patrol it. There's no work going on in there. And wives and children and partners can wander in and out.
That's exactly what
Yeah.
They can bring in
There was-
food.
Yeah.
They're probably not really getting searched in the way that we would expect in this country.
There was whole families sat around with
Yeah.
prisoners having like a picnic on
Yeah,
there.
So it's
and
just
they
part of their
they bring in
society.
food and money and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, big gang culture. The trouble is, where we're watching it, we are looking at different programs and stuff. We're seeing the production piece.
Yeah.
Yes,
we're not
of course.
seeing the reality.
No.
And they are very different. Actually, we've got a friend who spent time in a jail in Thailand. And she wrote a blog and everything, and she was accused of smuggling drugs, wasn't she? And she spent, was it 3 months? Was it 6 months?
Yeah, she spent a while. I can't
It was
remember.
long enough, and she said it was horrific, and like the whole journey of that process, it was so hard.
But the question with that then is it harsher for a Western European person to be in those prison conditions, bearing in mind the culture that we live with, as for a person that's of a local type who may see it differently and go, well, it is what it is.
That
and
depends
I
on
can't do that.
That depends on the individual. The
Yes.
person that we know is very well travelled, very well versed, very intelligent, worldly. Really understood things. I think probably spoke parts of the language. Really, was quite intelligent in that sense. So therefore, I think she probably will have found it slightly easier than somebody who maybe has gone on holiday, who's very naive to the world, and actually has then been incarcerated. And that does happen, not as often, but that does happen.
I do think that you're right there in that sense of someone that's from the society, because prison is that kind of reflection of the society you're in anyway. There's a marked difference in terms of that experience.
There were 2 girls that got caught doing something similar some years ago. One of them was been released since, but one of them was doing some just a bit of a talk back on a documentary show and said it was the most horrific thing she'd been through. I go, but that's by your standards. By their standards, they might consider that to be relatively a prison sentence.
It is.
And we do the same here. People will talk about prisons here in a different way than we talk about prisons in Europe. Yeah. Because if you go to, we mentioned this before, if you go to places like Norway and you go to prison there, when you walk into your room, you're going to look at it and go, wow. Or vice versa. If a Norway person comes here and we chuck him in a cell, they might go, oh, this is a bit hard, I can't be doing this. I didn't do this when I was in Norway.
Let's pick up on Norway very quickly, seeing as you mentioned it. So Norway are 140th kind of in their ranking. So they lock up 49 per 100,000. 49 people per 100,000.
One of the lowest. Yeah.
It's definitely,
for what I call
lower end,
a right up to date modern economy. Really one of the lowest.
Yeah, I mean, they have a 94% male population, which I don't think is far off the average. 95 is the average. 95 is the average. So it's not a million miles
It'd be
off.
similar to ours.
They have 25% remand, so they have a quarter. So it's not that different. 73% occupancy. That's one of the lower end. Having a 73% occupancy is pretty impressive, because obviously you've then got 27% of beds, space. You've got 27% of.
So they're never under pressure. Because believe me, I've worked in the service when we're locking 3 prisoners up in one small cell, And that applies pressure.
Yeah, because
It applies pressure on the prisoner, and it applies 3 prisoners in one place. It applies pressure on the staff, incidentally, because you have to manage all that in extremely confined conditions, and very often you're struggling for the resource. Sometimes, right down to sheets and blankets. Right down to sheets and blankets here. I've gone down to the stores, they go, we ain't got any. Sorry? Well, I got a prison just come to the door and we got no sheets and blankets. Can't help you, mate. We got none.
You've got a better story than that. I'm going to ask you to sound in a sec. But Shrewsbury Prison was, for a period of time, one of the most overpopulated prisons in the country.
Yes,
and it was when
but
you
it
were,
wasn't
when you
uncommon
were,
for
when
all
you were
local
freeing up,
prisons.
as you say. So
Yeah.
built for 1 person per cell, went into 2 person per cell, which is, you can have 2 people in a cell, let's be honest. It's cramped, it's not comfortable, but it's doable.
Yeah, that's still common today.
3 per cell. I know when you wander around Shrewsbury now and you look at the interpretation spaces, and you can see the bunk beds, and you go, okay, well, I get that. And there's interpretation space where you can see what a prison cell looks like now, kind of more of the Norwegian system with 1 bed, with showers, with everything inside there, more like a small hotel room. Then you've got your 2'd up cells, which is bunk beds, and then when you've got your 3'd up cells, where you've got the 3rd bed,
On the floor.
and suddenly it looks very, very different. There's not a lot of space.
And remember then, when we put you 3 in a cell, there were no toilets in the cell, there was nowhere to wash your hands.
Yeah.
So by any human basic standards, it's what it is.
But compared to some of the other countries we've been talking about, that would have been a VIP class of prison. The fact you've only got 3 in a cell,
Yeah.
and you've got a bucket. This is brilliant. This is amazing. Look at this condition.
And what's that? Oh, it's toilet paper.
But you had a story though. I recall. You hopefully you'll remember it. I know you.
Never know at my age.
I was going to say.
I'm telling you, John, it's not that easy to remember. Oh, Joel, sorry.
Because you had a story about prisoners with their pants, because you used to have prisoners who used to, their underwear used to go to the stores and be re-washed and just go back out to anybody.
I remember when prisoners, or I remember when they introduced that prisoners could keep their own underwear, socks and shoes. And it was all down to health and safety. Because we used to issue out shoes to prisoner and reissue and reissue and reissue, of course.
Like a bowling alley.
And they did the same with underpants and socks. But
Not like a
underpants in
bowling alley.
particular. You can imagine now, some laundries that operate these things may be better than others. But there comes a limit of life for anybody's pair of underpants. Trust me, folks, when underpants need to go past the washing machine into the bin. But remember, we were recycling these underpants. Even though prisoners' numbers were stamped on their underpants, it didn't take long for that to get lost and or washed off, or they'd just get chucked into the wrong bag. Prisoners working their laundry wouldn't be that, they go, oh, that's close enough, can't read that, that's close enough. So there were prisoners receiving other prisoners' underpants, but they'd been washed probably hundreds of times and worn by probably 30 or 40 different prisoners.
Yeah.
There comes a time
Because it's not
when-
like you get released and they go, well, those ones got to go in the bin,
Yeah.
because John's been using those, so those go in the bin. And the next guy comes in,
Yeah.
we'll get a fresh set. They're just rechurned.
No, I mean, they were supposed to get 3 sets normally, 1 in stores, 1 on their back, and 1 in the laundry. And that really wasn't overly effective either, wasn't worth. And quite rightly they decided, well, let's prisoners look after their own underwear, socks and shoes. I'm all for hygiene in a prison.
Yeah.
So it was better. Some of them washed their own things in the sink, to be honest with you.
There are
And you
people listening to this now going, all the things you've spoken about over the last 5 episodes, the last 4 episodes, this is the one of the worst in terms of like having to share your underwear with other prisoners.
But I
It's
remember
that random fact that sticks in people's minds.
But even today, some prisoners wash their own underwear rather than putting it to the laundry system, having to wait to get them out. They'll just wash them out themselves, and you can see them hanging up in the cells.
Yeah.
That probably is happening today. Not every prison, but I can imagine it is happening in prison today.
Well,
It certainly happens here.
And it's one of the reasons there's so many, again, if I take Shrewsbury and Shepton, but when the 2 prisons that you can go and visit, they've got, you can still see the lines. I regularly speak to people, and they go, oh, look, somebody must have tried to hang themselves in that cell because they've got a line hanging down. It's like, no, that was a washing line. They used to put it up to hang,
Yes.
to hang their clothes
Yeah.
up. And I went,
Yeah.
oh, it's like, we wouldn't leave up a ligature, just to be very clear, that's not something that gets left up.
Just in case. No.
It's lines washing, you can see them. So.
It's interesting because we were talking about Norway when this came up, because obviously you talk about the showers and stuff, obviously things
Yeah.
that will help them with elements of that hygiene
Yes,
now as
yeah.
well. Obviously that's a marked improvement from pre-toilets.
But we moved toward it, haven't we?
We have.
Modern
It's
prisons now have
interesting
showers.
that new prisons are being built with those kind of hygiene and basic
Yeah.
human rights kind of elements.
Yeah.
Yet the criminal justice system across the country looks like it's edging towards the privatisation and the American side of kind
I
of
know.
Rack and
Rack
stack
and Rackham. Whereas
Yeah.
in Norway, where they've got those level of comforts, their system is very different and very much about rehabilitation and reintroducing people to society.
Yeah.
So we've got elements in terms of their cells and their conditions which are leaning towards that, but the overarching kind of system seems to be a little bit more kind of leaning towards America.
Well, we do have more focus on rehabilitation. You two really pressed on that quite heavily when we talk about why we have prisons, what are they for. Rehabilitation is, and that's going to continue to be a massive thing because the way I think our governments are structured, and because UK is UK, we spoke about this before the show, but the way we're governed effectively is we have a party that governs the country, whereas in America, yes, there's a president, but actually the president doesn't have a huge amount of say, of any say,
not in that.
across individual states. Individual states, you've got 50-odd states.
The Senate would create laws.
But you've got each individual state will do things in a slightly different way, and therefore one state might lean far more towards rehabilitation, and another state leans far more to execution.
Yeah.
So that you get that disparity, and therefore it's kind of almost luck of the draw of which prison you can end up in. Whereas I think in the UK we have, thankfully, got a good handle on rehabilitation, and we're slowly going that way. And I think what will probably happen in the UK system, I'm going too much into this now, is we're going to go down this really weird track of going more like an American system and bigger prisons, racking, packing, stacking, you're a number, you're not a name. I also think what will happen at the same time is we'll go down this road of rehabilitation. So we'll be trying to do the American system and the Norwegian system, and it's one foot in both camps. And I think ultimately what will happen is neither will work.
And I feel that
you only need to go one way.
The problem with the American system is if we use that style of locking up more and more people and giving them longer sentences, that's going to put your need for much bigger resources to introduce the rehabilitation. And governments there will be a limit to that. There'll be a limit. If you want good rehabilitation, you really need to lock up less people, not more, if you think about it.
And that shows in the statistics, doesn't it? And Norway's recidivism rates, their reoffending rates are so much lower than other countries.
But it's more than that, because if you look at Norway's figures, you have to take that figure as you see it. And if it's such a low incarceration rate, then you have to accept it's probably a lower crime rate.
Yeah.
I don't believe they're letting everybody run around the streets for committing crime. They might deal with it. So if that's true, then there's a question asked, why is that then? Why is it that Norway, which are very like us in their lifestyles, they have families, they're independent families, they go to, similar kind of lives really, and then I say, well, why is that? Why is it that they have less people being locked up or even committing crime?
Well, they don't send their kids to school until a little bit older. Their education system's different.
Well, the childcare system's different.
Their childcare system's different, and
their social
maternity leaves are different. And is it Norway that has the starter pack for babies? I can't remember what it's called.
The social support system is stronger even when you're in work and you've got kids this big.
Yeah.
If you've got a problem with losing your job and all that, you'll probably find the support network is stronger there than it is perhaps in the UK. People still get confused about the UK. They talk about people getting unlimited benefits. Benefits were limited in 2015 by David Cameron to £13,400 for a single person outside London. And that includes rent, everything. You cannot claim more than that limit. If you earn less than that £13,400 in a job, you can claim working tax credits. But you can only go up to that limit. See what I mean? So even people say, they get everything. I go, no, we know that minimum wage works out about £19,500 a year. Yeah. And if they say that's the minimum wage for a single person, remember, a minimum wage for one person is £19,500. If they say that's the minimum, then you have to ask the question, well, what value is £13,400? Because you're already £5,000 worse off than the person that's living on the breadline.
That's a minimum wage, not a living wage. There's a difference once again.
There are many people that are paying out living wages.
Let's also, I'm going slightly off the point, but let's also remember, just for a second, I'm going to throw this in, that if somebody earns 19,500, I think it's 19,600 actually on minimum wage at 37.5.
Yes.
That's not what the company pays.
No, companies pay more than that, of course.
About 25%.
National insurance and tax and stuff.
Yeah, and then sickness, holiday,
absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to jump to Australia, I think. We'll have a quick conversation about Australia.
Australia. Mike.
Okay, and now we're getting complaints from all the Australians about accents. So we're going to take a quick break. During that break, I think the three of us are going to have a look at moving to Norway by the sounds of things. Yeah. So we'll be right back after this. Yeah.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Shrewsbury Prison, Shropshire's #1 tourist destination. Step behind the gates of this 200-year-old prison and discover an unknown world. Heritage tours run by ex-officers, where you can see the cells, walk the landings, see and touch the history. But there's so much more going on. Experience one of our brilliant activities or take part in our world-renowned events. From escape rooms to axe throwing, overnight sleepovers to prison break, we do it all. And there's something for all the family, with activities starting from 8 years, events from 12 years, and heritage tours for all ages. Visit our restaurant and experience food behind bars. There really is so much to see, do and discover on a day out at Shrewsbury Prison. Visit us at www.shrewsburyprison.com.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back to Life Behind Bars. Today we're talking about prisons around the world and criminal justice around the world. Apologies for me smirking and laughing on the way back in. Graham's just been cracking a joke literally as I come back in with our intro.
Pick it up on the outtakes.
Yeah. Just before we jump to Australia, we're going to go to Australia. It's interesting because there are no figures for North Korea or Somalia. None at all. No figures in terms of the counts.
There certainly wouldn't be in North Korea.
Exactly.
We don't even know how many people live there, let alone that.
So there's just nothing. So, I mean, who knows? It could be one. They might not even have prisons in North Korea. Well, the whole country is really...
There might be summarily shot in North Korea. That's why they have no prisoners.
Yeah, I mean, the whole country is I guess, again, I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but... Australia. Okay, Australia, 41,000 prisoners.
Population of about 25 million now.
Oh, I don't know. I think I should really grab that.
It's about 25 million now.
What do you think the capita is at? Rate per 100,000?
In Australia, I don't know that they very much operate a system very similar to us, and living and work there, particularly in the city as well, crime rates would have been roughly the same as they are here, I would have thought. So I'm going to put them up at about 120 to 130 per 100,000.
Little bit low. Australia are 160 per 100,000.
So they lock up more than we do as a percentage.
They do, and I'm going to be really rude out to Australians. So if you are Australian and you take offence to this, please do feel free to ping me a message. Australia are pretty much bang on the average.
Yes.
Across the board. The average for male prisoners across the globe is 95%, Australia 93%. They're talking about the national, so what the national is, actually they're slightly higher, national is 74, whereas Australia at 83. But in terms of the occupancy, as we spoke about the occupancy earlier, 118% is the average, with 33% on remand, and Australia is 112 with 32% on remand. So pretty much literally across the board. But what's it like to work in a prison in Australia?
Well, it was different in as much that, first of all, they carry firearms there, or don't carry them around. Just like America, you've got your armed towers.
Yeah.
What I can remember, I came out of a system because I was in the prison service here first before I went there. So there was a bit of a culture shock to me when they said, okay, we're all off down the firing range now, we're on the training school. We're doing what? Going down the firing range. And that's where you get all the Remington pump action shotgun. You've got then they use...
You don't need to aim with a pump action shotgun, can I just point
and they also used a weapon then, a rifle, I don't know whether they do today, it was called the Ruger 223.
Yeah.
And then they also had the Smith & Wesson, what they call the police special pistols and all stuff like that. But you never carried them in the daytime within the prison confines. They were only designed to be up the towers. And you wore them if you went on escort. So if you took a prisoner out on escort to a hospital, one officer, the one that's not attached to the cuffs, of course, that's carrying keys, will also carry a Smith & Wesson, a pistol, basically carry a pistol. So that was different there. They also dealt with, when I was there, riots or inconcerted indisciplines and sit-ins in yards much differently than we do today.
Let's pick up on the next episode, because episode 6 is all about riots.
Yes, completely different. There's a whole different... Now, I've got to be honest, it's been a long, long time since I've been there. I can't imagine they would have probably changed that system a great deal when you're talking about your basic security stuff and managing indiscipline.
What was the culture like inside being...
I worked in a remand centre. In actual fact, there was no available work for prisoners at all, except the ones that were working in the kitchen and the ones that were cleaners There was no work for prisoners, so we had hundreds of prisoners pushed out onto the yards, just like you see in America, where they've got the weights in. We had 4 yards, cut into 4. The gymnasium was in the middle, with 4 separate doors.
Yeah.
So you take those in for an hour or two to do the normal gym stuff, and then you go back out to that yard. But then you'd have a one that had grass on it, and they could play what they call touch rugby. There was another yard they could play what they call paddle tennis, which is up against the wall. Another yard that didn't do much at all. They just sat around there with tables all around. All got undercovered ways. So if it rained, which it would do in Australia very heavily at times, they just stay out there. Remember, it's hot there. So they were going to keep them outside virtually all day. Put them out at 8 o'clock in the morning, bring them in at about lunchtime. They'd have their lunch, and then they'd go back out into the yards, and that's where they stayed till about 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and then back onto the wings. That was the remand prison that I worked in. But I did find when I used to do overtime up in one of the convicted prisons at the top end, because there were 5 prisons all attached to each other, all got different levels and different reasons, I found there was very little work for prisoners there. Even the convicted prisoners had very little work. And they had a very similar system of just one big yard right in the middle. All the wings were around the outside, and there was just this big patch of ground in the middle. And there were, some prisoners would work, of course they would. But they didn't have a huge amount of work, and this was a prison for convicted prisoners.
You've got to ask, haven't you?
Now that might be different today. I'm giving you history here, folks. So I can't commit, unless there's somebody out there that's either worked in the Australian prisons or people that live there that know the difference. I'd be more than fascinated to find out, because it's difficult to pick up this information through the internet.
Yeah, it's interesting to wonder what were the stats for Australia?
Well, they're
They were average,
bang
weren't they?
bang on. Australia's average.
There was one
It's
time.
just because obviously we talked earlier briefly about the American system being very heavily driven towards labour, and then somewhere like that, Australia and other countries where there isn't work and there's a lot of sitting around, I think equally that can't be healthy for people, because your mind, you're not being active, and that's not a great way to live.
And to be justified to Australia, they have a system similar to us. They have open prisons. They tend to call them things like afforestation camps. They put them right out in the bush, and they're going to go out and do those things that you might do out in the bush, whatever that might be. And there are medium-term prisons as well. So it's not just all towers. These are the standard prisons, and so just to justify that, it's not one system. It's very similar to this country in that.
Towers and such like that are more about security. I mean, we'll pick this up in episode 6, obviously we'll talk about rights, but they are more about security rather than anything else, and stopping escapes.
Well, oddly enough, in Australia, unless they've changed all that, a prison officer that worked amongst the prisoners would also be expected to work up the towers, which doesn't happen in the United States. The United States pay security guards, or what they call armed officers, and a correctional officer isn't a person that goes up towers.
Is that so you can separate the emotion from actually, I know this person, I know their name, I know how they behave? And
you have to have a different qualification to be a correctional officer than you do to be an armed guard, and that's no disrespect to people that work in the armed industry, of course, but you'd have to have a different correctional level of education. Now in Australia, you could be a prison officer, and for the first 4 hours of my day, I'd be dealing with prisoners on the landing, or generally like visits like everybody else does. And then I'd have lunch. I used to have a 20-minute or 30-minute break, and then I'd go up an armed tower. And I'd go up the tower for the afternoon. So you actually wore 2 hats in that sense,
Sorry, Emma's just looked at me because she's like, what the hell's going on? I should point out that our studio is set above the execution room in Shrewsbury Prison. And right now I can hear a school tour of about 50 kids is just coming down the stairs underneath us. So there's 59 have gone in, 49 will be going out. That's obviously a joke, people. We don't really execute children. So there'll be 50 kids beneath us. So that's going to be an interesting next few minutes.
Can I just say, but before we move on from the Australian one, when I was there, I always thought they had a very interesting system of, it was called weekend detention. And I don't know if it exists anymore.
No, I came across this when I went to Australia, so I lived in Australia for a year.
But I think they've done away with it, and I'm not sure.
It was the most, I worked with a guy who was on this, and I remember I was in a sales job, and we used to drive around during the week, Monday to Friday basically, in a car, selling, like bang on people's doors. Which telephone company with? To sell you Telstra effectively. Trying to get this guy was proper gift of the gab, the Jack the Lad, all the tricks, could sell loads of people, could sell anything to anybody. And then one Friday, as we were driving back, so I was quite new, must be my first week, and we were driving back, and it's just going to drop him off. And I was like, okay, just assume we were dropping off his house. Pulled up outside a prison, and he got out, and he went, see you Monday. And I was like, okay, I didn't really think of Monday morning, on the way out,
Back to work.
I then picked him up
Yes.
on the way out, and what? And they were like, oh no, he spends a weekend in prison.
Yes.
What do you mean he spends the weekend in
it actually
prison?
made
What the
some
hell's
sense.
this?
It sounds like you're working during the
So
week.
it picks up certain
You don't get the
crimes.
freedoms.
It picks up certain crimes where people are not going to be. It's not about
He was there
violence.
for
at
flights.
risk.
No, he was there. He'd been,
Oh, well, that's
he-
unusual, but yeah, okay. Weekend, having a punch up.
It was exactly that.
So they go Friday night,
Yeah.
you turn up here. You'll do certain lessons in education through the Saturday and the Sunday, and probably about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can go home, or sometimes to Monday morning, and you carry on and go back to work. But what it did is it kept people that were working employed and with their families.
Yeah, and he earned loads of money. He was the best salesman we had.
Yeah.
His name was, his name was Scott. He was as I would say, a stereotypical Aussie in 2001. He had blonde hair. It was quite neat, but he was a proper, typical kind of Aussie. And he had great chat, great with people. Made so much money during the week. I mean, thousands of dollars.
So it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that you go.
But then, and he would go out hard. Like we would go out drinking. He wasn't allowed to go out drinking at the time, but when he did, he would go out drinking. He'd go out drinking quite hard. And I think what happened is he got into a fight, and I think the other people as well had the same thing. But he was in prison, and it was only about 10 weeks he had to do this. But it was the second time he'd had to do it, and I was there during when he was doing it, and when he finished. I remember going out drinking with him afterwards and being like, God, that whole system seems so bizarre going into the weekend to do prison.
If I remember
makes
it
some
correctly,
sense though, doesn't it, in terms of
if I remember it
types of
correctly, when the
detention.
judge handed down weekend detention, it would come with the threat that if you don't turn up for that, you're going to prison full time. So you might say, I'm giving you a 6 months prison sentence to be served by way of weekend detention. Have no illusion. You don't turn up there, you're going through those doors. And it's a one-off chance for you to stay with your family, keep your job. It sort of made some sense to me.
He did it every weekend.
I'm not supposed that it's completely successful, but
Must be a
interesting
huge
though,
thing to manage, though. Like the
well,
administration.
I thought we tried to introduce it in this country, and I can't remember whether we did try to introduce it way back in John Howard's in the 90s. And I don't know whether it was part of the short sharp shock.
When Graham said,
not that John Howard.
I was going to say we should clarify John Howard because we're
John
talking
Howard,
about 1890s.
MP from the 90s, through the Margaret Thatcher eras and stuff like that.
Because we do have the
I'm
drug
sure they
tax.
introduced it, and it was part of the short sharp shock treatment. But for some reason, it never either came to fruition, or for some reason it stopped very
That's what I
quickly.
was saying about the previously. Sorry, Evan. That's what I was saying previously about how the governor had said to me, sharp shock. Thank you. Short, sharp shock treatment. Sorry, carry on. Sorry, apologies.
You interrupted me now for
It's in there somewhere.
It
I was going to say that on your tombstone, isn't it? John interrupted me. I'll carry on what I was going to say.
It kind of makes some sense to me as well. I didn't know that sentence existed, but the thing you said about it, you can't remember whether or not it was trialled. That flags things for me as well in terms of how many things get brought in, but then chopped and changed again, and we never see things through for a long enough time to see whether or not something actually works. And I just think there's it's almost like we're walking down these two paths at the minute, like we said before, and I'd like to see more of like that and the Norway systems. And something I liked about the Norway systems was the way they kind of portrayed it as making better neighbours, that kind of reintegration side of thing, and that more kind of community spirited side of things. And it wasn't just about their sentences; their actual society seemed happy with the level of their shorter sentences and making people useful again. Whereas here, there's you can see that big divide in the country in it between that kind of more kind of restorative justice, that rehabilitative side, and across the board, and that hangman and flog. And there's a real split in the country between the two
How
sides.
do you change the culture in a country, though? Because cultures, by their nature, are sort of they just create their own cultures, don't we?
Yes,
How do you step in now and change the culture? Because Norway probably have got a history of that kind of culture way back in time, that they've decided to step in at that level very early on. Because changing a culture of a country is not only probably virtually impossible to do that easily, it could probably take about 40 to 50 years to achieve it.
Yeah, because it's got to be
change
done over
the way we think.
generations.
And there isn't a government that I know of yet that's willing to step down and start that process off, but it's very, very small things. And you may I'd personally start right there at childcare level, people keeping their jobs, and the poverty level. I'd start there, personally.
Yeah, I think
Whatever I said, I've worked in prisons for 38 years, and I've seen it all.
Then those these
But
young
prevention is still better than any cure.
exactly,
It
and
always will be.
they then grow with those new
Yes.
children growing up, and they become a part of and leading way of the society of that
It's,
new change.
you know,
And it's I don't know much about Norway's government at all across the
That's 7
board,
days
but
to research this, do you know what I mean?
forgot what I was going to say now.
Sorry.
They have a more of a socialist identity. People mistake socialism with communism, and it's not. But they've got a more of a socialist attitude towards the society and community they live in.
Yeah.
About a shared set of values rather than opposing sets of values, which we tend to have here.
And I think that's becoming apparent quite worldwide at the minute. You see it sort of obviously with Italy's more.
There's a drift to the right. There's a drift to the right.
There's a drift to the right in politics. And it's worrying to see such a split across countries, and you don't know at this point which way it will fall, because it will eventually fall to one of those sides. But at the minute, it's just an ongoing kind of back and forth to see which side wins out and which way the culture shifts.
I was only reading, was it yesterday, there was somebody that was convicted for throwing boiling water on an ex-girlfriend. Got about 6 years in prison. Not going to argue about whether that's justified lengthwise, that's an academic thing. But so many people I were reading on there were talking about an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
They should have boiling water, and some were going too far as sugar, and you go, I wonder where they found that out from. But sugar. and then they're saying, well, hopefully there'll be prisoners in jail that would do that in the name of society for them. They want other people to do these things. And I go, so what we're doing is we're reaffirming that violence is an answer to something that we condemn. You can't do the two things in one sentence.
Yeah.
And they're talking about condemning the violent person that did that crime by creating another violent scenario. And I just can't get my head around that.
Well,
I understand emotions, I do. I understand people get angry and we want to feel that we want to hurt other people.
They're coming from it as a punishment. The punishment should be you have done to you.
Yeah,
but there's an argument to be said here, and again we're getting started. Let's say, for example, that you let's take a crime like that. You throw boiling water over somebody, for example. Now, if you're found guilty and the judge turns around and goes 6 years or 8 years, or we throw boiling water over you and you don't have to serve any time inside. I was like, what? Why? I'm just playing the devil's advocate here.
Why?
I wonder how many people would turn and go, I don't want to do 8 years. Chuck the boiling water over me as my punishment. And I'm not saying it's obviously not the way to go. I'm just making the point that what the people are saying.
Yeah, you're talking about an eye for an eye.
Yeah, they're talking about an eye for an eye. So that is and I'm actually totally agreeing with Graham and with yourself in the sense, if the eye for an eye, nobody would say, well, throw boiling water over them and then they can go free.
So if somebody
So they actually want more.
They've got to serve 8 years and then throw boiling water. Well, that's not an eye for an eye.
No. And then if you go for an eye for eye, you take it to its conclusion and go, okay, then so you've just arrested somebody for rape.
Yeah.
So the answer to you now is we're going to have you raped.
Or you can do.
Who are you going to ask to do the job for you? A rapist that's into boys or a rapist that's into women? Because that's the only way, because any decent person, well, I'm not going to rape somebody out of revenge. That's a horrific thing to do. So I know, we just go to prison. You're a bit of a rapist, aren't you, mate? Yeah, tell you what, will you do us a favour? We just want to bring somebody into jail. We want you to rape them for us, please.
My God, what is this show? God, I'm not sure.
You started this eye for an eye.
You started it. The fact that you went, excuse me, mate, you're a bit of a rapist.
You might need to cut certain bits out of this, of course. But that's it's a real argument, though, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Because you're bringing back
people won't be lining up. People won't be lining up and say, they come up and say, "Oh, I'll line up to throw the boiling water on that person for you. I'll line up to do that because he's a horrible scumbag." I say, "Well, no, this person's a rapist, so we want you to come and do that."
It can't be illegal and legal.
We've
can't use it as a
gone
punishment.
so far off the point. Let's pick these up then, because actually we've picked up a few points here which will connect with riots, because there's always something that happens in riots which prisoners do. So let's pick that up. We're obviously starting to move towards now about punishments in terms of executions and stuff like that, which is episode 8. I'm desperately can't wait to get to episode 9, because I think I'm going to blow people's minds with the way that prisons currently are, where they're going, and it is so connected to the political systems that you have both been talking about, and actually how we make that cultural change. It's just, I think episode 9 is really going to kind of open that up. But you're absolutely right. People don't necessarily ask questions, think, because let me ask you this before we finish. when you go on holiday somewhere, or if you choose to emigrate, for example, as your parents moved to New Zealand a number of years ago now. You obviously went to Australia. I went to Australia for a while. We've travelled. If you go on holiday somewhere, or you're going to move to another country, how often do people look at the crime rates or the prison rates before going? Is that ever a factor?
No. People in this country, probably the vast majority of people in this country, never think about prisons in any sense of the term. People that, I've always said, the only people that truly know what goes on in prisons are either prisoners and their families and staff and their families. The general public don't really address these issues. When I do the tours, many of my people are really quite surprised at the things I tell them. I go, I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of that. And I go, that's because I understand that. We worry about doctors, nurses and teachers and all those things, paramedics, and firemen, because they affect our everyday lives. Prisons don't affect the general public in the way that other things do. So it tends to be something you switch off from until you feel that you want some input into it when you see an horrific crime, or burglary, or whatever. We've all got an opinion on it, but then probably by tomorrow we'll be talking about something else and thinking about something else. Prisons don't feature, they should to a degree. Why? Because we pay vast amounts of money to operate them in the name of the public. They are still part of society, aren't they?
Something a lot of people don't understand, isn't it? The system, and they don't actually pay, like you say, pay it any attention, so therefore they don't know what.
Even I today struggle with the sentencing structure in this country, and I keep up to date with it as best I can, because it's hugely complicated, probably one of the most complicated systems I've been. Certain things under 4 years, certain things over 4 years, certain things with the parole board, then you've got your life sentences with your tariffs in there, then you've got your manslaughter with life sentence with tariffs in there, then you've got the discretionary life sentences, and you've got the mandatory life sentences.
He's gone, we've lost him.
And that's not even including the community sentences.
And that's just the UK.
Yeah.
That's not even other
No,
countries.
it's really, really highly complicated. When you look right into it, you go, whew, this is hard.
Let's leave
voluntary
it
manslaughter, involuntary
let's stop. That's episode 7. Let's stop there because we've reached our time. What a great opportunity though, just to plug our sponsors at both Shrewsbury Prison in Shropshire and Shepton Mallet Prison in Somerset, because both of which are open to the public. They're the only opportunity in the UK to wander around a prison, see how it actually operates, be led by ex-prison officers, or the tours designed by ex-prison officers, see interpretation spaces throughout the years. I'm really giving them a good plug here. But you can actually see, learn, feel, touch, engage and educate around what happens behind the walls. And you know, they're done in a realistic way. Nothing is sugar-coated, nothing is falsified, nothing is faked. It is real, exactly how it was, from when the prisons were built, from the 1600s, all the way through to when they closed, and even pick up on some of the modern day stuff now where they connect with modern prison officers from places like Wrexham and such like that. Yeah. And interestingly enough, I was reading a piece on the internet just yesterday about the oldest prison in the world, Shepton Mallet Prison. So going back to 1625. Anyway, that's a big enough plug, I think, for our sponsors. We'll have to up their sponsorship fees. But that has been Life Behind Bars. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, any comments, anything you want to throw back at us, please do. We'll be back next week in episode 6, where we're going to talk about what happens when prisons go wrong. So specifically around riots, of which you've seen instances yourself. You've obviously both seen bells go off before, alarms and such like that. So we're going to pick that up when prisons go wrong, which is going to be next week. Until then, I'm going to say goodbye. I'm changing the outro, see? So I'm going to say goodbye and I'll see you next week.
See you next week, guys.
See you next week.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.